Welcome, David, to the Human Endurance Podcast. We're super excited to have you on today.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure also from my side. Let's start with a big, broad question. We would love to hear from you. What do you consider your coaching philosophy, if you have one?
That old chestnut. I guess I've been coaching nearly 30 years and really, my approach has always been very evidence-led. So I try to coach not based on what I've given previous athletes, and then I think that, that's the panacea to success, or not based on what I've previously been given by other coaches. Simply what I try to do is look at the individual and what their strengths, what their weaknesses are, what their goals are, and align that with what we sort of principally know about training, training as a whole in endurance sport. And typically that aligns with what we know from sports science, and what coaches have learned over the years.
Got it. And what would you say, what are some personal experiences or values that really build a foundation in your coaching approach with the humans you coach?
Yeah, I think with any coach-athlete relationship, there's you need to have a very clear alignment in what your expectations are of that coach-athlete relationship. Typically where, some coach-athlete relationships go sideways is where, maybe the athlete hasn't fully communicated that their expectations are, and that a coach is simply there to write the training and, and be, speak when spoken to. Or that actually they want somebody that is, their friend and their compatriot, their consigliere, their mechanic, their cook, So, those are two sort of extreme points of view, but the reality is you really need to button that down. I say to any coach that's starting out, get a very clear understanding from an athlete what their expectations of the relationship are, and what your expectations are of how that relationship should work in terms of communication, in terms of, feedback, data, all of those sorts of things. Coaching, whether it's in a corporate environment or a sports environment, it's predicated on trust, and it's predicated on open and honest communication. And you start to play around with those two things and you run into problems. So principally the two qualities, and I know the old adage of, trust is earned, but there is an element of trust that's needed at outset based on the expectations of each, party. So, the two biggest important things for me are, integrity and trust. And then, those two are sort of wrapped up in the communication style. And, and sometimes that's difficult when you've got a coach and an athlete where there's, a different gender, there's different culture, there's a language gap. Somebody maybe their first language isn't English. So conveying certain things maybe becomes difficult. There's a power gap if there's a big age gap between the athlete and the coach. And those are all things that as a coach you have to try and bridge in real time. So how I might coach, a 27-year-old male English guy is very different to how I might coach a 22-year-old Brazilian female.
So do you, when you start coaching an athlete, and we know you coach people from all over the world, so different cultures, different gender, different backgrounds as well, professionals, but also amateurs. Do you set some expectations, and do you also have some clear requirements on the relationship from the athlete, irrespective of their background?
Yes. Typically, I would explain, how I coach in terms of communication, in terms of, how I might analyze data, how often we would speak. Some coaches, when they're working remotely, you can't always be with all your athletes all the time when you've got athletes across 5 different continents. And so what I try to say to athletes is, look, we'll message, we can message, email, phone call, as needed. I try to be available as much as possible within the realms of, also having my own personal family. So, and time zone differences, but I try to be available as much as possible. Some coaches are much more like, Fabi, your time to phone me is 5 p.m. on Friday. And if you don't phone me at 5 p.m. on Friday, it's not my problem. That's not coaching. That's something different. So I'm very, very clear about the communication. I'm very clear about what I expect from a feedback perspective, because, the old adage of, if you aren't measuring, you aren't managing, and I'm not saying that I'm, a data freak, but, data and subjective feedback give you context. And, some people will feel, explain that they're not great with subjective feedback. They might just be like, yeah, all is good, or they might not even put any comments, but then they will very definitely put comments when there's something important to say. Other people will just write, an essay in every workout, and that's fine too. It's whatever the athlete feels is the best way for them to express that process of training. And then, of course, there's the data to analyze.
And you also outlined before that you're evidence-based, so you build on a strong scientific background and research, and you don't just apply things that work for somebody to somebody else. But how do you distinguish that? Because it could, if you have an approach that really works with athlete A, how do you not tend to try to experiment with athlete B on this approach? How do you know where to draw the line between the science and what you actually discover yourself?
Well, I think that's the difference between sort of, knowing and thinking and guesswork. I would say sort of what I know in terms of training principles, and any coach, with many years of experience will understand, is basic principles. Get the basics right. That's 80% of the training. And that's not as simple as very specific workouts or training philosophies. That's it's almost like a lifestyle choice, like how to be an athlete, not just the training, but the sleeping, the eating, psychological aspects, managing stress. That's the 80%. Then there's about 15%, which is what you're referring to. Like, hey, I used this particular approach with this athlete, maybe this other athlete, and they responded well. I think that's a good thing to do. And then there's 5% where between the athlete and the coach, a lot of the athletes I know, they know their body well. There's 5% that's just pure guesswork. You might see a scientific article that says, oh, there's this new novel technique, blood flow restriction training. I don't dabble in it. I think it's worrying. For me, I think that just is an example of something that's like worrying about which make of spark plug to put in your car, when actually you probably just need to put petrol in the tank. That I think some of that stuff is also down to particular workouts. Some athletes might respond really well and like doing a certain type of workout, and you might let them do that, even though it might not be the perfect thing. Because it's not as simple as there is a formula. There is not a formula for success. If there was a formula for success, there'd be plenty of coaches driving around in Ferraris, and it's the human is a complex, adaptive being, physically and psychologically. So, hence the need for coaches to manage all of that.
Yeah. I'm super curious to dive more into what you consider as the actual basic principles of training. You did mention lifestyle, you mentioned sleep, probably you also mean recovery. Can you give me a little bit more details of what exactly you think are the basics, and how do you translate that? How do you communicate that to athletes or encourage those kinds of behaviors?
First of all, with any athlete, as they're getting seriously into the sport, whether professional or as an amateur, what you don't know what you don't know. So, I try and get across to people, if you're not sure, ask the question. If you see something in the social media, ask the question, because there's no stupid questions. So, a perfect example is the Norwegian Method. A lot of people talk about the Norwegian Method and measuring lactate, but if you actually speak to the coaches that have built that dynasty, what they talk about is effectively is the lifestyle that those individuals have lived and the choices that they've made, the professionalism that they've taken into, like a no compromise attitude to workouts, and lifestyle. And, that's such a massive, massive piece that's almost impossible for people to replicate. When you hear Harold talk, that, he started out giving them lots and lots and lots of aerobic training when they were juniors, and he did that for many years, completely contrarian to what every other governing body coach was doing, and he just had faith in what he was doing was the right thing in the long term. And all credit to him, it was. You can't replicate that as a 37-year-old age grouper that's married with 2 kids. You can't say, oh, okay, yeah, I'm just going to spend the next 10 years just doing masses of aerobic volume and not take on board my parental responsibilities and not really do my job well. So I think we need to be really careful about understanding what are really simple basics. Are athletes sleeping well? Are they fueling workouts properly? What people don't realize with long distance triathlon training is it's probably the most time intensive training of any sport. Professional cyclists don't really train more. Professional swimmers don't really train more. Professional runners certainly don't train more. So the training load on the body from a metabolic perspective is massive. And often athletes run into difficulty with things like back-to-backing workouts because maybe they're rushing, they've got some admin to do, they've got to go to work. And so I'll just do those 2 sessions back-to-back. And then they build up calorie deficits and they wonder why then every sort of 3rd or 4th day they're wrecked. And they're like, I don't understand, I'm doing my training, but so it could be as simple as just timing when they have meals. So they're not dieting, it's just the timing of their meals. So, are they fueling their lifestyle choice, appropriately? Are they sleeping properly? Are they, getting off electronic devices, a good half hour before they go to bed? What are stress triggers for them? Is social media a stress trigger for them? Is communication, generationally speaking, there is a younger generation now where they communicate in different ways, different mediums. And sometimes, just replying to text messages feels like a burden and a stress. And so as a coach, you need to make sure you communicate with them. Hey, what's the best way for us, to communicate? And for some people, it might be like, hey, I just want to just check in at the end of the day or first thing in the morning. But you have to set those expectations. Otherwise, you run into issues.
Yeah, I really, I'm not a professional athlete by any means, but I've done a full Ironman and I know how much training that takes. And even, as a amateur, this is not my profession. My life had to evolve around not just the training, but exactly what you outlined, like how much do I sleep? When do I eat? Just to not constantly, feel tired, and you really need to focus on those small things. And I also know, especially for them professional athletes, I guess those seemingly small things can make a big impact over time, because I also heard once a podcast with I think it was Kat Matthews, and she was talking about how she could improve her swimming the last season. And she was just saying, I traveled a lot and I always made sure I still get my pool session in, because it's then easy to kind of, have 3 days of no training or little training. So like really having those small things, adjustments to really be professional in the approach, and really the training is like your center of your life, so to say.
And I think that's, it's that professionalism word. And, when I work with amateur athletes, a lot of them tend to come from, quite driven corporate backgrounds. And there's correlations there. If you work in a corporate environment where you have, KPIs to hit or things to deliver on certain timescales, people to manage, you quickly learn that you need to be very clear and concise and honest with your communication. You quickly learn that you need to do X by Y date, and those qualities carry over into how those people tend to apply themselves in sport.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Now, David, we know from previous conversation with you that you spend about half of your time actually doing research or looking through research, trying to gain knowledge, and the other half of the time it's actually the time coaching. Can you tell us more about the research that you find? Like, are there particular resources that you find useful? What are the things that you're trying to learn? Just give us a little bit of insight on what you're looking for there.
I mean, I have been coaching a long time. So in that time, I've probably built up a database of nearly 4,000 scientific papers. Now, that's not a brag to say that, I'm this sort of scientific grand wizard, but it's more to say that, when I'm giving people advice, it's coming from a place of evidence. It's not coming from a place of intuition. If somebody says to me, what do you think about doing altitude training? I'd say, okay, right. Well, what we know about altitude training currently is X, but we also need to contextualize that with your own physiology. Are you going to be somebody that's going to respond well to altitude? Are you going to be somebody that responds poorly to altitude? Are you going to be somebody that needs just a couple of days at altitude? Are you going to be somebody that needs like 2.5 weeks? That's what people don't understand, is they think things like, heat training or altitude training are just like these panaceas to sort of performance improvement, and they're not for some people. I know of a very, very famous athlete who I was talking to about, altitude training, and they trained in a squad environment. And that squad, always did altitude camps prior to a lot of key races, and the coach would always bring them down from altitude at a very specific number of days prior to the race. For this particular athlete, that was like the worst number of days. And we know from research on elite athletes is that the perfect time to come down from altitude can be anywhere between 3 to 17 days. Now, as a coach, it's like, well, that's a great piece of research, but it's utterly useless to me because 3 to 17 is like a 2-week period. So, you quickly need to understand the individual. Say, okay, well, what is the physiology of this individual? And before you start playing around with those sorts of things. So that's an example of, digging into the weeds of research, or digging into the weeds on, lactate testing and lactate metabolism. Is this athlete somebody that actually generates a lot of lactate, which would typically be normal in, somebody with more muscle mass? Or is this somebody that doesn't really generate a lot of lactate? And so what's the implications of that from a fueling perspective in the context of sort of glycolytic pathways? So again, it's know the athlete, to try and understand the individual, because a lot of these individuals are physiologically the 1% of the 1% of the 1%. I can give a perfect example where I had 2 athletes at one point, both male, both physically fairly similar, performatively fairly similar on the bike, within a minute or 2 of each other performance wise. So kind of fairly similar aerodynamics. One was more power, less aero, and one was, less power, more aero, but their performances were about the same. For one of those athletes, their perspective was to feel good, to feel like the right sort of stress response in their body, pretty much 6 days before the race or 5 days before the race, they needed to ride the entire bike course at race power, which for a male pro, it's going to be somewhere between 315 and 330 watts.
Mm.
That's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And then the other person was very much of the point of view, the entire week of training, and they still trained fairly, normally, like any sort of normal taper leading into the race. But from an intensity perspective, they said, for me to feel good, don't give me any more than 5 to 8 minutes of race power. And everything else needs to be aerobic. And you look at that and you go, well, unless I had that experience with those individuals and I talked to them and I communicated with them about how their body feels, how do they respond well, there's not any scientific article that's going to say, well, that's an indication you should do X, and that's an indication you should do Y. you need to work through some of these things and actually talk to the athlete, because a lot of them have the better the athlete, the more introspection they have. And what I mean by that is the better the athlete, the more self-awareness they have of, how their body works and what it does. And they don't necessarily, know the exact mechanisms by which that's happening, but they just know that doing X makes me feel good, doing Y doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, also when we talk about research, right, you always have to understand, especially with newer research coming out, it has been done on a specific type of group. And
Yes,
if that
100%.
applies to that 1% of the person that you just talked about, that's another question. So I guess what you outlined with, you also need to feel how that feels and not just blindly trust the research, because again,
Yes.
everybody's different.
Yeah, and that's very typical with scientific articles, is that you're testing a fairly homogenous group of individuals. And by that, I mean they're all fairly similar. A good example of this is there was some research done on subjective ratings of perceived exertion as a measure of training load versus, other more analytical methods like, say, lactate or heart rate. And they did it with elite swimmers, with a squad of elite swimmers. And so, of course, you have to understand that if you have a squad of elite swimmers, they have an innate desire to stay on the squad. So when the coach says, you need to give this feedback, you need to give this rating of perceived exertion, they're going to do it. So that's your compliance taken care of, when in fact in the real world you might come into a compliance issue. And the second thing is, all those athletes are very, very physiologically similar, whereas in elite triathlon, athletes are very different. You just two extremes. Look at Lionel Sanders and look at Jan Frodeno. Physiologically very different, biomechanically very different, but both world-class athletes.
Mm-hmm. What's your take actually on measures of intensity? What do you prefer to use with your athletes? Is it RPE? Is it lactate? Is it heart rate? Is it something else?
I think with, lactate, so many times I've had this conversation in the last couple of years. Again, I've been coaching so long that I joked with another coach recently. We were joking, how many times have you experienced this idea that lactate-based training is the panacea to success? And he said, yeah, for me, it's 4. And I was like, yeah, for me, it's 3. It's like every decade we come around and we're like, oh, lactate is, going to be the secret to success. And lactate can be insightful, but you need a lot of context. So I think it's one of those things where I think you can use it to do, say, a lab test, ramp test, submaximal test, and you can get some insights from that. With technology today, I work with Inside, which is an analytical platform which can give you some very powerful insights purely from testing. At the other extreme, you can measure, virtually every single workout. And that will start to build up context around, okay, when I'm tired, when I'm overreached, when I've had too much coffee, when I'm glycogen depleted, this is what my lactate's doing. And all those things impact on the lactate readings. But if you're kind of just dipping into it occasionally and you're losing that granularity, that context, then it's very difficult. You may as well just be reading tea leaves. So I kind of feel that it's one of those things where you either do the former or the latter, but you don't do anything in the middle. More day to day, I'm interested in work. So, our athletes are using power meters. They'll use pace in the pool, and they'll use pace on the run. We'll contextualize that sometimes with heart rate and most importantly, perceived effort.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we get really wrapped up in the semantics of training, like, this, we're talking about this and we need to do this. And it's like, yeah, but what actually is the goal of the workout? Are we interested in, again, lactate training, not to bully on lactate training, but, this idea of using it for intensity control, it's like, there's no problem with that, but you need to understand is like, okay, if we're governing our training by saying, okay, this workout, we're going to do the intervals at 3 millimole, that's where we want to be, plus or minus a little bit. Okay, that's a physiological response, but actually, is the goal of the workout a mechanical desire? Are we actually wanting, the muscles to contract at a certain rate and a certain amount of force production to create a certain amount of mechanical stimulus? So the start point as a coach is like, what's the question we're asking? Are we interested in work and then as a consequence stimulus, or are we interested in sort of load and as a consequence stimulus? Or are we blending those things at different points of time? There's no one right answer. It's just sometimes you need to step back and say, okay, well, what am I getting hung up about when actually I don't really need to be getting hung up about this stuff? So I typically use heart rate, power, pace.
I think that's also where, again, this evidence-based thinking comes in, not just, I see what they're doing with lactate, let me just do the same, but really zoom out, understand what the science about lactate and training with lactate, and then apply it to your own case, and just instead of just copy pasting. So that's super interesting.
I just want to make a point. I think when you're describing the limitations of using lactate and how it's not like a panacea for all, just reminded me also of a very common conversation around HRV, which is pretty hyped now, right? Which I think also comes with the same kind of connotation sometimes, where people think, okay, we're going to measure HRV, we're going to know how stressed you are, we're going to be able to overcome any kind of overtraining. And we know that it's also not the same, right? You need to contextualize it, you need to make sure you take it at the right time and away from certain kinds of stressors and the kind of stuff. So yeah.
And
funny.
actually, and again, that compliance aspect, again, measuring the HRV in and of itself may be stress creating, because I've had that with an athlete. I know I had one situation with an athlete that I coached where they've got young kids and they're like, there is 0 point in me measuring my HRV in the morning, because most mornings it kind of entails some 4-year-old jumping on my head at 6:30 in the morning. Like, well, why would I measure my HRV after that's happened? And then the other athlete was like, look, I understand the point of measuring this, but just like waking up and having to go and do this thing stresses me out. I was like, okay, fine. Well, then, we just need to communicate. Sometimes the most powerful thing in coaching is literally looking the athlete in the eye or speaking to them on the phone saying, how are you feeling? Cut the bullshit. Don't pond skate emotionally. Just like, how are you feeling? And that can often be more powerful than a lot of measures. And that, and that's the other aspect of what I spend a lot of time researching these days is artificial intelligence and how that, is going to impact coaching as a whole and coaches and athletes. And, I think it will be a very positive thing.
Yeah, actually, like since you're mentioning AI, I mean, we're also super into this topic, and we know that you also just had you were doing a presentation or a speech last week, right, about this topic. So, what is your take on how AI can advance human performance or training? If you have like some points on that.
I mean, I think the first thing to say is one of the things that people rail against with, it as an analytical tool is they say, oh, well, excuse my language, sort of shit in, shit out. It's like, if you genuinely believe that the AI is incapable of filtering out erroneous data, then I'm not sure you understand, the power of AI technology. So, we can get rid of that as a misnomer. I think where its strength will be for good coaches will be as a force multiplier, in the context of allowing them to focus on real coaching. And what do I mean by that? I mean, the funny thing is if we go back probably before you two were born, before power meters existed in the sort of the early 80s, and even earlier, what was coaching? Coaching was behavioral engineering. It was motivating athletes. It was a coach would stand on the side of the track. He'd look at how an athlete moved. He'd look at their body language. He'd listen to their tone. He'd look at their expression. He may make a decision on what's the most appropriate workout based on a broad framework that he has relative to a competition in a future date. But he's managing their well-being and their behaviors and then their ability to execute. then we have power meters and heart rate monitors and GPS devices, lactate, glucose, outdoor VO2, O2, kinetic measurement devices, HRV, the list goes on. And, we're drowning in data. And the funny thing is that you need to step back as a coach and say, okay, what's going to make the boat go faster? Is this important? Is this relevant information? Or is it relevant with this athlete, but not relevant with this athlete? Because again, measuring HRV could be a stressor for somebody. That's a perfect example. So again, context. So I think what AI will allow us to do is really, really drill into sorting out what's relevant and what's important and what adds value, and allow coaches to focus on, managing, the emotional well-being of athletes and their behaviors, their professionalism, just talking them through that and saving coaches the trouble of doing a lot of data analytics. And that's, we don't need to get into the realms of, what jobs are going to disappear and not disappear. But I think, I do think as a coach, we will, I firmly believe this, we will go through a period of identity crisis, because I think a lot of coaches, their identity is wrapped up in what they know, the knowledge that they have, and then their ability to package that up and deliver it in, in a communicative style or in an executional style. And that's their value. And all that just disappears. Mm-hmm. All that's taken care of. Now, it's not to say that you don't need to have that knowledge to look at the, maybe the guidance that you get from AI and say, okay, that's great, but actually for this individual, I know that I need to, contextualize it, change it a little bit so that it's more efficacious. It's the most effective thing for them versus just what, has been prescribed as the perfect thing to do today based on previous workouts and analysis. And again, managing behaviors, it's managing emotions. And, yes, if you go full crazy, you can get into the realms of using AI to analyze, emotional well-being. You can use it to analyze tone in communication. Yes, that's where we may end up. But I still think, societally speaking, people need people. There's a very famous piece of research where they were looking at, what happens if you isolate a human, and I think it was a French anthropologist, a scientist, who went and lived in a cave, and they set up video cameras. It's just many years ago, and they filmed him, and he had no access to light. He had no clocks. He had nothing to measure time with in any way. And he was down there about a month, and, within a few weeks, his days were longer than 24 hours. They were more like 25, 26, if I recall correctly. And he also started to, hallucinate, start to go a little crazy. So, my point with that extreme experiment is for people to understand that, socially speaking, we thrive on connection. People need people. We're more inclined to trust somebody telling us something, based on their knowledge and their wisdom, and then contextualizing it to us, than, perhaps, a device. But that's not to say that I think there is a younger generation who will have no problem, opening their phone in the morning and, a little avatar pops up and it's Coach Fabi and it says, hey, good morning, Bruna. I can see you slept well. Your HRV's good. Your training went really well yesterday. This is what you're going to do. And you'll literally speak to that avatar and say, oh, that's fantastic. Great. Tell me what to do and I'll go do it. And they'll have no problem doing that. But I think I think it's in thirds. I think there's an older generation, maybe sort of a bit older than me, who are like, I don't really understand AI. I know it's this technology thing, but I'm just going to put my head in the sand and just ignore it, and it'll be what it'll be. I think there's a middle generation, and that generation, societally speaking, is probably the largest driver of GDP. That sort of sort of mid 30s to late 40s, early 50s. And that generation sort of, is aware of AI. They understand that it's, it will empower them. It will provide, insights, far quicker than humans have been able to do. But they maybe just need somebody to, cut to the chase and say, right, go do X based on, the evidence. And then there is that sort of third younger generation. And I think as a coach, if you're working with, that second and third generation, you need to also understand that, a great example from last week, and it's not something I said, actually, Sebastian Kinley, who I was presenting with Sebi, and Sebi said this. He said, you could be in a situation as a coach where you need to talk to a young female athlete about how, maybe they just need to lose a little bit of weight to increase their performance. It's a hot topic, particularly in cycling recently, when the world champion came out and talked about it. The female world champion came out and talked about it openly. But as a coach, again, I'm male, I'm in my 50s. If I'm talking to a young 20-something, it's a topic that I need to be very respectful of. I need to make sure that I'm communicating it in a very appropriate way, so there's no risk of any misunderstanding. But Sebi's point was, like, in that situation, that's incredibly difficult. And, that young athlete might go away and say, oh, well, coach said, I need to lose 2 kilos. Maybe it's better if I lose 4. And he said, but actually in the world of AI, that young athlete, if just, an app says, this is what you need to eat today, and then in 6 months time, you'll be 2 kilos lighter and you'll perform better, they'll just be like, okay, go do it. There's no emotion attached. So I think, it was an interesting, I never really thought about it that way. And I thought it was an interesting point Sebi made, how, it could also be used to strip away any, emotional attachment to communication and any risks of emotional
Yeah,
misinterpretation. And that's a small example.
Yeah,
but,
that's a whole other thing we could dive deep into. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, for sure, with a human, it's more emotional because you also don't know if is there a hidden agenda? Is it more about my looks than anything else? Yeah, so that's for sure a valid point.
Yeah. On the topic of AI, like, so many points that, like, there's so many directions to go here, but like, the way I like to think of AI, I actually work with it in my professional career, is I think, the framework, at least for now, is going to be that AI will take over tasks and not full jobs. And I think for coaches in particular, for sure, I think the first wave will be the task of analytics and data crunching and all of this part that indeed maybe a lot of coaches specialize in the recent years because of the evolution of all the wearables, etc. But it is going to be very interesting. I do think that the first wave is exactly what you described, where AI is going to be on the supportive role, helping coaches to parse through data, and it's going to become much more important.
I think that's, and sorry to cut you off, but I think that's a really interesting point that you make about the data, because also the risk is that suddenly this will be a mechanism by which coaches, the process of coaching athletes can be held accountable. And there's plenty of coaches out there, I've literally heard athletes, come to me from other coaches and say, oh, this coach's point of view was like, the race is the measure of performance, is the measure of, success. And it's like, well, I don't really buy that, because it's a bit like going into a bakery and saying, excuse me, do you sell bread? I mean, if you come to me as a coach, then you're coming to me to be more successful and perform better. So let's not have a debate about, the fact that the race is going to be the measure of you getting better, because actually, an athlete could perform in spite of the coaching, not because of the coaching.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that AI will do is it also will hold training processes and principles accountable. But what's also exciting is, broadly speaking, there's this idea of, polarized training or pyramidal training or lactate-based training or HIIT-based training or VO2 max training. All of that becomes completely irrelevant, because AI doesn't have any cognitive bias. It doesn't have any, learning bias.
That's
It
not
simply
exactly
looks
true.
let me explain that. It has learning bias in the sense that what the data that you train it on
Yeah.
informs it. But what I mean is nobody's taught the AI that, polarized training is how you should train endurance athletes. It just looks at the data that it's given and says, okay, based on the data that I have, this is what is the best thing for this athlete to do. So I think these heuristics that certain coaches have, a good coach, ironically, a really good coach has the ability to go deep on, one or two particular topics that are relevant to the performance of their athletes and, call that 80%, deep. And then 20%, they can kind of cover a lot of other topics that relate performatively speaking. Whereas I think AI will just be like, well, I don't really care about these heuristics of that training style or that training style or that training style. I'm just going to look at the data.
Yeah, I guess it's not like, oh, I'm following strictly polarized training and across the board, and it really looks at the data, so it's really less biased in that sense, for sure.
And that will hold coaches accountable. That would be like, and that might create fear and grief in some coaches, and that's okay. That's a process that we have to go through. I think many people will go through in jobs.
Yeah, I mean, it's like this huge wave of change, right? And I think people in general now try to protect their knowledge in which they invested for years. And this knowledge now seems more democratized. And I think the winners will kind of try to go with this wave and see how they can develop. But I feel the losers will try to protect and be stuck, which I see as a...
I think if you cling on to the idea that your knowledge is your USP, your time is your time is limited. I think if you, as you rightly pointed out, if you learn to allocate resources smarter and better, like, okay, this tool for this circumstance, this tool for this circumstance, this tool for that athlete, that tool for that athlete. If you learn to do that quickly and efficiently and seamlessly and manage the behaviors, manage the emotions. I keep coming back to that. I just think that, whatever technology does, we've been through all sorts of technological changes, and you can argue that AI is the biggest by far of anything. But the reality is people need people.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's not fun. I was just telling that some time ago, I was doing a race, a half Ironman, and I was just by myself. Nobody came to watch. I didn't go with anybody, and I finished a half Ironman. It was a PB. I was happy, but somehow, something was missing because I couldn't share it with anybody. I was alone. I was like, yeah, that was a bit fun. So it's
and that's so so understanding your intrinsic and extrinsic motivations would actually be quite powerful, because really what you're doing is for the experience and the enjoyment with other people. Is not necessarily the sort of like, oh, I rode at 220 watts, in that, part on the bike. I mean, I think again, the humanistic aspect of coaching, a great example is Steve Magnus, who's a famous run coach. He gave this example of somebody that he coached when he was at Houston University, and how this particular individual, like, ridiculously talented, but before every big event, they would end up throwing up. And so, of course, that impacts on, their stress levels, their, calories. And it was very problematic, and it would happen before. So Steve thought about it, and he sat down and he said, you know what? Okay, let's write out our pre-race routine, and then let's just choose when we're going to go and find a quiet corner. And I'm just repeating what he said on a podcast. So, he didn't tell me this, but he said to this athlete, let's just decide when we're going to find a quiet corner, do the throwing up thing, and then get on with the rest of our warm up. So let's actually write it out. Like, okay, we're going to do our A skips, we're going to do some jogging, do our A skips, do some thought on mental prep. Then we're going to go and find a quiet corner, throw up, and then we'll come back and we'll do these exercises. And then, we'll, change into our race shoes. And they were, and she was like, yeah, okay, let's do that. And then, the next big race, he's like there and he's like, right, okay, do this, do that, do that. Okay, right, let's go find a quiet corner. And then, went to do that. And it was like, I don't feel like being sick now. I don't want to be sick. He's like, okay, right, well, let's move on to the next stage of the, the warm-up preparation. And that's such a human, aspect of understanding that individual and like managing the situation that just technology like wouldn't do that. And that's just what I think, coaching will continue to be, is a very, very human thing.
Absolutely. Human connection.
And I mean, sports in general, we would never see a robot doing an Ironman and cheer for a robot. I think that would be weird.
I mean, we might see a robot doing an Ironman, but I'm not so sure we would cheer for it. We'd probably find it quite entertaining. Although I'm trying to think how a robot would float. That would have to be one. You'd have to throw out the wetsuit regulations on the Ironman rules.
Yeah. But let's go to another topic. AI is something very, we could dive in the whole day. But I have some question about a topic that you touched on briefly before, which was the kind of the long-term horizon planning that the Norwegians had, and especially professional athletes can follow. And I'm curious for you to understand, like, how, especially pro athletes, when they come to you, how, if they, do you have people coming with more like short-term goals or long-term goals, and how do you handle that?
I mean, I've definitely had athletes come to me and say, hey, look, I want to qualify for Kona in 6 months. And, that's okay. Most of the athletes I work with, the amount of time I work with them is years, not months. And so, we'll sit down and have a very real, like, okay, where are we at now? Where do we need to be? There's plenty of data out there. We can, even for an amateur, we can look at the new qualification rules. We can look at past results. We say, okay, right, 32-year-old female, Ironman Italy, you want a slot based on last year's results and the new allocation rules. You're going to need to do this time. Now, realistically speaking, accounting for, maybe there's a bit more swell and chop in the swim, it's a bit windier, but that's the same for everybody. But, if we take that number as a guideline and say, okay, you're relatively benign weather conditions, environmental conditions, is that, do we think you can do that? And, we can back calculate what that might be required from a power perspective on the bike. It's like, okay, right, well, if we know that you need to ride at 195 watts for that kind of bike split, then, your threshold needs to be X. And okay, where's your threshold now? So it's kind of like, it's a gap analysis. It's like from a business perspective, it's like, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What are the opportunities for you to train? What are the threats to your training? And for some people, commonly that threat is, work stress, or family stress. And I think sometimes it's important to bring into the discussion, not me personally, but for the athlete to bring into the discussion their partner, because there's a huge responsibility on their partner to support them. And particularly with elite athletes, there's very few people that really truly understand what it is to be an elite athlete. And funny enough, when I've had athletes that are elite athletes that have come from a corporate background, and we're chatting about how when they left corporate world, it's very often like very, very senior executives that they maybe knew get it. And they're like, yeah, I get what you're doing. Pursuit of absolute performance, totally get it. But, maybe people that they worked with that were around them didn't necessarily understand. And I think that's something that, and a lot of elite athletes struggle with, is the need to say no. A friend, sends you a message and says, hey, do you want to, should we go to the, the golf range, hit some golf balls, hang out and have a couple of drinks? No, sorry. I got training tomorrow. I got a run session. I got a swim session, but you can come around and, we can, have a coffee and chat. And for elite athletes, they quickly find the people in their lives who respect what they do and, are totally comfortable with those commitments. And it's a big commitment. And they quickly find that there's people that actually, it's not about being their friend, but it's about them being that person's friend. And that sounds really clinical, but it's just the nature of elite sport. I've had athletes and friends that have been, Olympic athletes, and they've missed, sister's wedding. I've got to go on that training camp. If I want to go to the Olympics, I need to be attending that training camp. I can't go to that wedding. And it sucks, and maybe the broader issue there is the attitudes of the coaches and the governing body. But as a mindset, that's kind of, again, going back to the Norwegians, there's just no compromises on workouts. That's what Harold said. They're very professional in their attitude to training, and that's what it takes. And for some people, that's a step too far. They kind of want to do the elite thing. They want to be recognized as an elite athlete, but they're not willing to commit to the sacrifices, and that's okay. But that might limit where you end up, performatively speaking.
Yeah, it's like with people who want to do an Ironman, like amateur people, and they want to do an Ironman, but then they kind of, they really want it, they say it, but then the actions don't speak because the training is not done, or not at least consistently.
And as a coach is also where you need to communicate and be really honest. The swim is a really common one. You get people that want to do an Ironman, they want to do well, they maybe even want to qualify for the World Championships, and you're like, okay, how often do you swim? And they're like, oh, I swim, 3 times a week, and I swim about, 9,000-10,000 meters. That's not going to cut it. It's not going to cut it. You need to be swimming as an age grouper, most age groups, male, female, you probably need to be swimming, somewhere between 14 to 16,000 meters, yards a week. If that's logistically a problem, then you need to accept that and say, hey, actually, I can't do that logistically with my circumstances and work, travel. So, okay, fine. So then, what can we do on the bike? What can we do on the run? And just accepting that, okay, the swim is maybe not going to be where you want it, but, there's other aspects that we can focus on. And some people are just blessed. I got one guy I coach, really doesn't swim that often, only really when his son is training, and his son's like 10. And so he basically swims like once a week, and he had like the best swim he's had at the weekend. He had the best swim of the last 4 or 5 years of his, athletic career. And he's like, oh, maybe I can just swim once a week, and it's like, you just have good feel for the water. So, you're lucky, but don't think that it's a successful aspect. It's an in spite of aspect.
Yeah, don't tell me that, because I do swim like around 10,000 meters per week. And my swimming is not really, it's improving slowly, but I do feel it's very hard, because I rather it just translates better on the bike and on the run, and on the swim for me, it's a bit of a gamble. So,
and I've seen, I've been around a long time. I've seen lots of different swim coaching approaches, like philosophically speaking, this approach, that approach. But the funny thing is that when I've had athletes that, I coach athletes in the swim and the bike and the run and nutrition and psychology, but when I've had athletes that have, say, gone to train with somebody famous, and they're like, oh, this really made a difference, this approach that we were doing in the workouts. And I'm like, let's step back a minute. It's like, okay, right, well, actually, the thing that stands out is you've spent 6 to 8 weeks swimming, 3,000 to 5,000 meters a week more than you ever did for 6 weeks. It's like, if you don't think that is the 80%, then, I'm not sure you're kind of getting, what the influencing factor is. For many athletes in the swim, volume is the key.
Good to know.
It's not that one, Drew.
No, if it was.
Yeah. David, I'm curious to hear from you, since you work with so many high-level athletes, if you ever had to deal with athletes struggling with burnout and maybe imposter syndrome or motivation, those things that sometimes can creep up when the performance benchmarks and the stress is quite high to perform, and how you dealt with that, if you've ever encountered that in your coaching.
So I'll answer it in 2 parts. The first part I'll answer is second half of the question, the bit about burnout I'll come back to. The piece around imposter syndrome, it's a fascinating one. I think in any high performance environment, I would say, my experience is about 90 to 95% of athletes, leaders, coaches suffer imposter syndrome. And, you know, if you think about it in the context of, say, like being an Olympic triple jumper or long jumper, you've been picked by your country for one Olympics, and then you're trying to train for the next Olympics, and you know that you need to like be able to jump 5-7 centimeters further. If you genuinely believe that that person's, you know, motivations for trying to get that 5 centimeters over 4 years is they just want to be a better version of themselves, they want to improve their performance. If you think that's the driver, then you don't understand the psychology of athletes. It's like that person probably has a very large amount of insecurities about, you know, are they good enough? Are they doing the right training? Are they taking the right approach? Do they need to use a different technique? Do they need to work on some aspect of biomechanics or, you know, looking after their body? So those are insecurities. Now, so on the one hand, with elite athletes, you've got a high level of insecurities around that in essence are a type of perfectionism. They're constantly striving because they're insecure, but they're not doing the right thing enough. They're constantly striving to do things better. But on the other side of the coin, you've got this ability to be highly introspective and self-aware of what makes them good, you know, in terms of their ability to perform and how their body feels. So, you know, the way I describe it is the very, very best athletes in the world, they have all these insecurities and anxieties, imposter syndrome, and that is the fuel for the bonfire of their success.
Interesting.
Then the athletes that maybe don't perform as well, all of those anxieties and insecurities, that becomes the bonfire that consumes their ability to succeed. It's kind of how I describe it.
So basically, can we then say that people with a high imposter syndrome, they constantly need to prove themselves that they're actually good, and they kind of always keep forgetting, and then they need to prove themselves all over again.
Yeah. And there's a famous example I know of. There's a professional cyclist who's retired now called Sir Chris Hoy, won like 1 million gold medals in the Olympics. I mean, he won the most gold medals in the velodrome of any British cyclist ever. And one of his compatriots was Bradley Wiggins, won the Tour de France. And Bradley was being interviewed and they were talking about this sort of topic. And he said, the interesting thing about Chris, he's like, Chris could be stood on the top step at the Olympics, gold medals just been put around his neck, national anthems playing. And in his head, he's already like, yeah, you know, maybe if I just changed my grip just a little bit, like I could get maybe another 2 or 3 watts power out of the start gate. I mean, that you know, as a normal human being, as a normal walk of life adult, you'd be like, that's messed up. It's like, no, but that's how these people are. That's how these people think. And, you know, I was chatting to Tim Reed about it, who's a retired, you know, world champion in triathlon. And Tim, you know, was saying to me that, you know, we were talking about this and he said, yeah, he said he can look back, and he's talked about it in his podcast. He can look back and see that oftentimes he changed coaches so many times, and it was because he was chasing this idea of like, oh, maybe there's this one other thing, this one other technique. And I've had it with an athlete. I coached one athlete who I worked with for about almost 2 years. And, you know, they said to me, look, I'm going to move on. I was like, you know, that's fine. That's great. You know, any particular reason, any feedback for me from a development perspective? And they said, well, actually, you know, I've looked at things, and what I've realized is I've never stayed with a coach for more than 2 years. I said, oh, that's fascinating, because what that tells me as a coach is that you're a student of the sport. You know, you're one of your drivers is your desire to learn and understand as much as possible to be the best athlete you're capable of being. You know, so that's why you're hopping around. And that's okay. You know, that's, you know, I don't own somebody's success. I'm just there to help them.
But it could also be that somebody just always thinks, you know, there's the better thing is somewhere else, instead of also trusting and sticking, and again, this long-term thinking.
And that was Tim's point. That was Tim's point, is that maybe in hindsight he looked back and say, yeah, maybe if I just, actually just cooled my jets a bit and carried on doing, and I've had that experience with an athlete, where, we got second at, Ironman World Championships, and, very quickly my brain was into, okay, what do we need to do better? What are the small changes that we need to work on? And instead, we went our separate ways, and that athlete decided to just throw everything out the window in pursuit of that very marginal improvement.
I think I know who this
that's
athlete.
Life.
Who this athlete is.
I mean, but that's life. It's
Yeah.
as a coach, I can't be all things to all men and all women all the time. I'm human as well. I screw up as well in terms of my communication, and sometimes some athletes are really understanding of that. They get the a human relationship, even though it's a work relationship, it's still a relationship. It has its imperfections, and sometimes there's bumps in the road, and that's okay. And other athletes just feel that you're hired to do a certain job, and if you're less than perfect at that job, then then they move on. And that's okay too. That coaching is a meritocracy. And like I said, you can't be all things to all people all the time. Try to be, but you can't be.
And it's never possible. When you were talking about how this feeling of like how a lot of high performing athletes feel like imposters, and therefore that drives them to continuously improve, and that can be the fuel that drives their success, I was also thinking that this sounds very tiring. If you're never able to kind of look back and realize, wow, I've been able to achieve a lot. And personally, I was a really good tennis player when I was younger, and I did go through a burnout. So when I was 20, I was like, I can't play tennis anymore. And I think I had some aspect of that, of never being satisfied, never really celebrating, and always thinking something could be better. And that just kind of drove me to the ground at some point, that I was just like, I can't do this anymore. What are your thoughts on that? Like, how can athletes manage to continue to strive for better without actually burning themselves out?
I think probably, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but, certainly in that type of instance, I think there's always a need for the coach to make sure the athlete understands that, the outcomes are not your identity as an athlete. You are a wonderful person, Fabi, because you're Fabi. You have these character traits, you have these mannerisms, you have this sense of humor, you have this drive and determination. So there's inherent qualities in you as a person that make you who you are, not winning that tennis tournament. So for an elite athlete, I would say the same thing. It's about the process. It's about the journey. It's about, the people that you spend time with on that journey, because you'll look back because that's what you'll remember. You'll look back and you'll remember, those experiences with other people, and that the measure of your ability is your commitment to the process. Like, how committed to being the best version of yourself are you? And so did you fully commit to that? Did you really engage in that and enjoy being in that process? Or was it that just the fixation becomes so much on outcomes that, those outcomes start to identify you? And that's, God didn't give everybody, or whichever God you believe in, but God didn't give everybody the genetics of Christine Blumenfeld. So, or Casper Storms, or Gustav Eaton. So you have to manage with the genetics that you have, and strive to be the best version of yourself. And, Ronda Rousey's book is famous for this, where she was meant to be an absolute shoo-in for the gold medal in judo in the Olympics. And she trained like a monk, really, really pushed herself to absolute limits and beyond, went to the Olympics and got fourth. And initially it crushed her, and it took her a while to realize it was never about the outcome, it was about the journey. And it's a cliche, but it just time and time and time. That doesn't excuse the fact that later in life, somebody might look back and still be really pissed that, they didn't get what they want out of the sport. But, that's life, or that they had success, but they wanted more success. That's still okay. But as a coach, there is a responsibility to help people understand that, outcomes are great. But, it's about the process. It's about being, the utmost professional you can be on a daily basis. And because that will be what influences your character and your core, and aligns with your core values.
Just quickly, because you're just mentioning the again qualities of a good coach, and I mean you coached Ashley Chant, Lionel Sanders, one of the few people, and now he moved to ChatGPT, Sky Monch. And what do you think is the one thing, like what makes you a successful coach? Obviously, you're evidence-based, etc. But what is the thing that you think why people choose you and stick to you?
Honestly, I just try to treat people the way I'd want to be treated. I was never an elite athlete. I mean, I say that, but I played American football for Great Britain as a student. Sounds very, very, very like, well, that's really weird. I worked when I was, coaching initially, I worked full time. I worked in financial services in an environment that was basically no salary. It was 100% commission. So if you wanted to eat food, then you had to sell. A very 1980s financial services type environment. So those driving traits, I can understand and empathize with athletes with a lot. And ultimately, I try to treat people the way that I would want to be treated. And that's it really. I can't put any other sort of special label on it or philosophy. And as I said, sometimes, I'm married, I've got 3 kids, so I'm a father, husband, and coach. And those are the 3 things that I do. I don't really do anything else. So, I just try, like I said, with athletes, I'm just trying to make sure that they can enjoy the journey that they're on. But they also, it might require tough conversations like any relationship. Sometimes, I've had athletes I've worked with where we've had to have really tough conversations, and sometimes those athletes don't appreciate it and they spit their dummy out and they leave. And other times, they might push back and, give me some tough feedback that I have to go away and reflect on. But it's always about, Professor Sophia Jowett talks about this idea about, complementarity between an athlete and a coach. It's like, as long as we don't lose sight of the fact that this is about an athlete becoming the best version of themselves. So, I might need to improve and they might need to improve, and we might need to have a really difficult discussion about things that that the athlete did leading into a race, or the way that I was communicating. But it's only ever about the athlete being able to perform, which again is about just making the best of any relationship, whether it's a marriage, whether it's a partnership, whether it's a coach-athlete relationship, whether it's a manager direct report relationship. If you can really, really strengthen and enhance that relationship through communication, then you're always going to see performance benefits.
And I think we talked about this before once, but what is that coaching gives to you personally, and also do you have an example of an athlete where you really some pride moment from this relationship that coaching brought to you?
I have always felt that if I can have a positive influence on somebody as a person, not just as an athlete, because again, I go back to my point about going into a bakery. If I can have a positive influence on somebody as a person that impacts not just on their performance as an athlete, but on them as a person, then that's really meaningful. Probably two extreme examples I have is I coached one lady who was really, really trying to qualify for the World Championships as an elite, and traveled to the far side of the earth relative to where they lived, and literally the day before they traveled, their brother committed suicide. And they then had to go and perform in that race with all of that emotional stress, and they did qualify. They did win the race, and they did qualify, and that was to witness, to be a part of that, was very, very emotionally meaningful, to see somebody achieve that. And, the other example is I had somebody that I worked with for many years, and they retired from triathlon, and then recently got married and asked me to be the celebrant. I'm not a religious person. Celebrant, you don't necessarily need to be ordained or anything, but they asked, them and their husband asked me to be the celebrant and do the ceremony, and that was that was probably second to my children being born as the most sort of emotionally rewarding experience of my life, because I also had to sit down and write a speech around what them as a person and our relationship. So yeah, and none of those things got anything to do with Kona or Roth or some Iron Man or Norseman, and none of it. It's about people.
The human connection again, yeah. It's I would like to see this speech. I'm sure there were a lot of coaching or sports references.
I'm trying to remember. I don't think there was. I mean, not so much. Or maybe one or two. Yeah, maybe one or two.
That's cool. We're coming to the closing. We have 3 final questions for you. You can be brief, however you like. So the first one is, I'm curious to hear from you if there is a myth in triathlon that you can think of that you'd like to take the opportunity right now to help them debunk.
I think it would go back to the I'm not going to put a label on any one specific sort of heuristic or coaching philosophy or training philosophy, but I think I would say that the myth is that there is one training philosophy or training principle that if you simply just apply this, then you're going to be amazing and awesome, and all your goals and dreams are going to come true, performatively speaking.
No panacea at all. Makes sense.
Yes.
And if there is an advice you could give to coaches, triathlon coaches out there, what would that be?
I said this before and I'll say it again. I think one thing that in any form of coaching that's hugely important is taking time in the day to just reflect on what you do and how you do it. And that can be as little as 10 minutes or as much as an hour. But I think any good coach, I take the example of Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett is renowned for just spending time in the morning reading. Any good coach should spend time just reflecting on what they do and how they do it, whether that's, reading, books that might relate in some way to the concept of coaching or leadership, or whether it's just introspection and just thinking about what they do and how they do it, or what they did yesterday or what they're going to do today. But I think that reflective process, hugely important.
I have a follow-up question on that, actually. I'm curious to learn if you also look at other coaching relationships outside of endurance sports that you inspire from.
Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of coaches in track and field or in a more corporate environment where, I look at what they do and how they do things. So, there's definitely there is, as a coach, it can be highly rewarding. You asked me somewhat around the quality aspect of why I do it. It can be hugely rewarding from a vicarious perspective, because you're experiencing things through somebody else. You're enjoying their success that you've been a part of, that you've been able to help them with. That can be hugely rewarding. But again, I always need to remember it's not my identity. It's not who I am. It's something that I do
as well.
Yeah. Cool. Final question. How about advice for athletes? What would you give them?
Try not to overcomplicate things. Invariably one of the most powerful things to improve performance is getting enough sleep. So, sometimes worrying about this piece of equipment or that helmet or this training device, well, actually, are you eating healthy? Are you managing your stress? Are you sleeping well? Are you getting off the phone and social media, half an hour before bed? Just those fundamental basics, get those right, do that consistently, and that would be a huge, performance lever.
Yeah. So before you buy the recovery boots, make sure you're sleeping.
But again, if you can afford to buy them, that's wonderful. But then if you use them every single day, then you're blunting your adaptation to the training that you're doing. So, recovery boots might be good to do if you're an age grouper who's bought yourself some recovery boots. Don't use them Monday to Friday because you're probably only training an hour and a half a day. But then if you train it like 5 hours on Saturday and 5 hours on Sunday, you might use them on Saturday and Sunday because that's just such a massive overload of stimulus on your body. Maybe helping with the recovery allows you to build, or you might go on a training camp, to the Canary Islands and suddenly do 30 hours of training in the week when you normally do 15. Then use them every day, So again, understand the context of these tools.
Mm-hmm. Good answer. We have 3 quick answer questions, so you just shoot the quick answer to round up the conversation. So, what's the most common mistake in triathlon training?
Really long runs.
What's a belief you held 10 years ago, let's say in the past, that you no longer hold?
I wouldn't say 10 years, probably 20, is that there was a formula, there was some magical formula that you could figure out in a spreadsheet that would, be the right way to succeed.
And what question do you wish athletes ask you more often?
They ask me more often. What could I do? What could I do better?
Cool. I'm going to ask her next time I coach.
Yes. Yeah. You need to be prepared, but you need to be prepared for the answer.
Yeah, true.
Sorry.
Nice. Cool. So that was it. Thank you so much for your time. It's really interesting.
No problem at all.
Cool. Thank you for joining.
Take care.
It was lovely.
See you.